Back when I was still teaching, I'd get the same question from family or acquaintances. What exactly do you do? And the second I'd say I teach game design, the response was pretty much the same. Oh, so you teach art? Like drawing characters and making things look pretty? And I can't really blame them. Where I am, anything with the word design in the title is automatically associated with graphics. You say design, they think Photoshop or CorelDRAW. But that's the first major hurdle we have to clear. In my last video, we talked about the engineering behind your favorite characters, your favorite waifus or husbandos, the psychology of the gap, and why you're all down bad for digital pixels. I told you that we'd look into the myths of game design, and that's why we're here. Now, a lot of you have that itch. You spend hundreds of hours in Star Rail or Wuthering Waves, maybe Skyrim or The Witcher, and you think, I could do this. I'd make the combat faster, the gacha better, fairer, move the story in this direction. But then you look at what you think is the barrier to entry. The professional art, the high-level math, or the complex coding, and you talk yourself out of it before you even start. I'm here to tell you that game design is potentially not what you think it is. And the misconceptions that I just mentioned, probably what's stopping some of you from actually picking up the craft. So let's talk about why your aesthetic biases and your artistic assumptions might actually be your biggest obstacles. Let's kill this first myth right now. Game design does not equal visuals. Yes, visuals are part of the design, but they aren't the whole damn machine. Just because the word design is there doesn't mean it's solely related to graphic design. If I design a car, the art is why a sports car looks sleek, while an SUV looks rugged. But the design is making sure the SUV can go off-roading while the sports car feels like it glides on a track. It's about the underlying logic that makes the experience match the expectation. In games, the designer is the architect, not necessarily the painter. You're building the logic, the rules, the flow, basically the experience. If you look at Nier Automata, however you're supposed to call it, people call it a gooner game because 2B has world-class ass cheeks. That's the aesthetic. But the design is how the combat feels fluid, how the BGM transitions seamlessly when you enter a new zone, and how the story forces you to replay the game to see the truth. If a game looks like a masterpiece but plays like a spreadsheet with 300 millisecond input lag, the design has failed. You can have the best graphics in the world, but if the mechanics and dynamics don't talk to each other, you don't have a game. That's just a tech demo. But sometimes the tech just isn't there yet. Maybe the console's RAM is screaming profanities at you, or your CPU has a scorching hot fever. In those moments, it's the designer's job to figure out a workaround that the programmers can actually work with. You've seen this 1,000 times. You're playing the Tomb Raider reboot or God of War, and Suddenly, Lara or Kratos has to squeeze through a ridiculously narrow gap in the rocks for 10 seconds. Or you're forced into an elevator that, depending on your hardware, takes a suspicious amount of time to reach the next floor. You might think that's cinematic. Sometimes it is, but a lot of times it's a design solve for a technical bottleneck. In older titles, that narrow crawl space was there because the hardware was trying to load the next area. Nowadays, even when the SSD is fast enough, designers keep them. Why? Because it's a point of no return. It controls the pacing, resets the mood, and makes sure the machine doesn't break if you try to backtrack. It's using a creative mechanic to solve a data problem. Now this leads us to the next big barrier. I can't code, so I can't be a game designer. Let me clear the air. A game designer is not strictly required to be a programmer. Does it help if you can? Yes, immensely, I might add. If you know how the engine handles data, you're not going to ask the dev team for features that are literally impossible. But it's not a hard requirement. The reality is, some studios might want a technical designer who can get their hands dirty in C+ or Blueprint. But the core of the job is systemic logic. You need to understand how the machine thinks, not necessarily how to write the code itself. It's like high-level sports. You have managers like Arsene Wenger, Jose Mourinho, or the NFL's Bill Belichick. These guys weren't world-class mechanical talents like Pele or Maradona. They did not have that god-tier physical execution. But they have a world-class head for the game from a bird's-eye view. They're the architects. They know exactly which gears to turn to make the machine unstoppable, even if they aren't the ones physically performing on the field. They understand the logic, and in design, that's what makes you the master of the engine. Think of it this way. The programmer is the one building the engine. The designer is the one tuning the gears and deciding the gear ratios so the car actually moves the way it's supposed to. Like I've said in my previous video, design is about balancing how something looks, how something feels, and how something plays. That brings us back to the MDA framework. Mechanics. These are the rules. How much gas is in the tank? How much crit rate a gear piece gives? Dynamics. This is the behavior. How does the car handle a sharp turn? How does the player handle the internal cooldowns? Aesthetics. This is the emotional response. Does the player feel like a pro racer or a guy driving a lawnmower? If you can understand that loop, you're already doing game design, even if you've never written a single line of code in your life. Now, I've mentioned the framework twice, here and in my previous video. I'm going to do a full dedicated breakdown of the MDA framework later, but for now, let's just keep those 3 letters in the back of your head. To put it in a more relatable perspective, as gamers, you've all whined and bitched about a boss being too hard, or maybe a quest being too confusing. We've all done it. Hell, I whine and bitch constantly on stream. But the thing is, when you do that, you're actually starting to think in a game design mindset. You've identified a friction point where the dynamics, which is how you're playing, aren't meeting the aesthetics, which is the fun or the challenge you expected. You're looking at the machine and realizing the circuit is broken. The input you're giving isn't producing the emotional output you were promised. Now, whether the solution you offer in the comments or on Reddit is actually good or not, well, that's another issue entirely. For most people, it's probably going to be crap. Before you decide you want to bite my head off, let me explain. It's not necessarily because it's a bad idea, but because either they don't have a decent enough understanding of the balancing act between M, D, and A, or they don't know what limitations the devs actually have, or it's actually crap. But the impulse, the act of analyzing why a game feels like a chore, that is the foundation of design. You're just missing the framework to turn that bitching into a solution. Before we continue, if you find this perspective useful, hit subscribe and join the community. I'm just here to share what I've learned. So let's get back into it. One of the most beautiful things about game design is that it isn't always a dictatorship. A designer sets the rules. But the players? Oh man, the players. They find the loopholes. And not everything unintentional is a bad thing. Since you're still watching, you've probably heard of this before. The story of Street Fighter II's combo system. That was a quirk in the code. The devs realized you could cancel an animation into another move. There are various accounts on what actually happened. Some claim that the devs thought the timing was too frame perfect, that no one could do it consistently. Others say that devs thought it added a layer of depth to the dynamics. In any case, they chose to keep it, and the so-called bug became the foundation of every fighting game since. The same goes for speedrunning. Designers don't usually sit there thinking, how can someone skip 90% of my level by jumping into a corner at a specific frame? But when players do it, they're engaging with the game's mechanics at a level the designer never anticipated. Sometimes the players even decide the game is about something else entirely. Look at AI Shoujo. Now, if you're under 18, I don't want you playing this game. I'm strictly using this as an example for academic purposes. And no, it's not the kind of academic purposes you're thinking of. But jokes aside, look at the actual design intent versus the player reality. The devs probably intended for you to spend your time, well, to interact with the 3D girlfriend. Let's just leave it at that. But if you look at the community, a significant chunk of players treat it like a hardcore survival and base building sim. They're more interested in the resource loops and the architecture than the fan service. That's the power of player agency. They can take your mechanics and create an entirely different aesthetic that you did not even plan for. But for every happy accident like the SF2 combo, there are intentional choices that backfire because the designers lost sight of who they were building for. Look, we have to talk about Dragon Age: The Vile Guard. Now, I'll admit I have not played the game, which is why I won't be commenting on the mechanics or the dynamics. The reviews for this thing are all over the place, but from a design standpoint, specifically narrative design, there's a massive lesson to be learned here. Sometimes a design failure has nothing to do with frame data or combat loops. It's about the authorial hand becoming too visible. When the internal logic of the world is sacrificed to accommodate an external message, the magic circle of immersion snaps. Some people agree with those messages. Fine. It doesn't matter what the message is. Once the player sees the authorial hand moving the puppets, the game stops being a living world and starts being a lecture. Whether you agree or not isn't the point. As a designer, your job is to build a possibility space that connects with your audience. When a huge chunk of that audience feels lectured rather than invited into a world, that is a mechanical failure of the narrative. Even the CEO of EA eventually had to address it, saying the game did not resonate with a broad enough audience. Now, you can wrap that in as much corpo speak as you want, but the fact is, the product did not meet the expectations of a significant portion of its audience. Look, design is a service role. If you stop serving the player's experience, their expectations, the machine breaks. And this isn't just a gaming problem either. I'll give an example. Look at the new Coke disaster of 1985. Coca-Cola back then had the dominant market share, but they were losing blind taste tests to Pepsi because people generally prefer a sweeter sip. So the executives did what they thought was logical. They reformulated the drink to be sweeter. On paper, the data said it was a superior product. In reality, it was a catastrophic failure of aesthetic design. They forgot that taste is emotional. This is the reason why your grandma's cookies or muffins taste better than anything you'll find at a Michelin star bakery. It's not about the technical perfection of the ingredients. It's about the magic circle of the ritual. People didn't drink Coke because it was the objectively sweetest liquid on earth. They drank it because of the history and the expectation. And man, the backlash was majestic. Nobody asked for a better Coke, they wanted their Coke. You had people forming groups like the old cola drinkers of America. There was one guy who reportedly spent $30,000 in 1985 money, no less, just to fight the change. Now that is the level of friction you create when you break a user's trust. For that guy, it was never about a soda. It was about the authorial hand reaching into his life and telling him his preferences were wrong. It took almost 80 days of failure, almost 80 days of getting up to over 1,000 complaint calls a day. Coca-Cola was losing more trust with every pickup before they finally relaunched Coca-Cola Classic and admitted that their fix broke something that was never broken in the first place. If they had acted in the first week, the wound might have closed. Instead, they let it bleed for months. By failing to act, they turned it into the legend that is still studied in classrooms today. It's the same fundamental trap. Whether it's a corporate spreadsheet or a social agenda, The second you prioritize an abstract idea over the actual experience of your audience, you end up with a product that looks great on a presentation slide but fails the second it hits the real world. The lesson here is that design should serve a purpose, not an identity. And if we look back at games, we can see how to do this right even when the goal is literally to be bad. Take Dan Hibiki. This is how you use meaning in design correctly. Dan was literally created as a joke character to mock SNK's Art of Fighting. Mechanically, he's a disaster. His moves are shorter, weaker, and he spends half his time taunting like an idiot. But Capcom didn't just make him bad and leave it there. They gave Dan a massive personality and a story that makes you actually want to root for the loser. Look at him in Street Fighter V. Dan is the only character with an intentionally programmed infinite combo loop. But here's the genius. It takes an insane amount of precision to pull it off. Later on, Capcom added a mechanic that could randomly break the loop if you're unlucky, but the chance to pull off an infinite combo is still there. They turned a joke character into a high skill ceiling masterclass. That is intentional design. They took a bad mechanic, which is a weak character, and used the MDA framework to create a unique aesthetic, which is the satisfaction of winning with a scrub. Now, if you want to see design that actually challenges the player without being a preachy mess, look at Nier Automata. I'm gonna be honest. I was way too high and mighty about this game at first. Back then, I had zero interest in so-called Gooner games. We did not have YouTube Shorts at that time, but all I saw on my YouTube feed were clips of players zooming in on 2B's ass while she's climbing stairs. I figured, okay, I see what this is. I'll pass. But then I visited my parents and saw my brother on his God knows what number playthrough. I heard the music for the first time. I heard Alien Manifestation, and man, it was majestic. The music didn't just play, it perfectly complemented the scenario on the scene. That was the first crack in my high and mighty armor. So I kept watching. I saw how fluid the combat was. I followed my brother play the character arcs. I watched 2B's facade as a stoic soldier start to crumble. I saw 9S's slow descent into madness. I watched A2 go from a robot-hating killing machine to trying to save robot children, only to have her heart broken when she watches Pascal lose everything. The reason I'm bringing this up is that Nier Automata works because it respects its own internal logic. It's not trying to fix you or lecture you. It's simply busy being a high-functioning machine where the aesthetics and the mechanics are pulling in the same direction. It's a great example of aesthetic supporting dynamics. And about the music that got me hooked, look up Alien Manifestation or Wretched Weaponry. I'll put up some more titles on the screen. You're welcome. These scores aren't just background noise, they are the emotional engine of the design. And then there's Detroit Become Human. The designers of this game weren't just writing a story. They were building a massive, playable collection of Heinz dilemmas. For the uninitiated, Heinz dilemma is a classic psychological exercise used to measure moral development. Do you steal the medicine to save a life, even if it breaks the law? A lot of games give you a paragon or renegade choice. Basically, it's either be a saint or be an asshole. Detroit doesn't do that. It understands the human psyche much deeper than just a binary switch. The game weaponizes cognitive dissonance. It puts you in a corner, hits you with a high-pressure timer, and forces you to make a choice that might contradict your established beliefs. You might think you're a law-abiding citizen, but when the game puts you in the shoes of someone protecting a kid, suddenly breaking the rules doesn't feel so bad. It makes you think, I shouldn't be doing this, but I have to. And that is high-level design. It makes you live the consequences of your own logic. There's also the empathy gap. Designers know that we naturally prioritize us over them, and that is the social identity theory in action. As humans, we're hardwired to favor our own in-group and dehumanize the out-group. By forcing you to play as the them, which is the artificial entity, the game bridges that gap. It's not politics as design, where a developer stands on a soapbox and screams their opinion at you. That's lazy, and frankly, it's bad design because it breaks the magic circle of immersion. Of course, this doesn't work on everyone. Design is a two-way street. If you're a player who fundamentally doesn't believe an artificial entity can have a soul or true emotion, the magic circle might never close for you. Or maybe you can, but you still find the disconnect too wide to ever really map those choices onto your real-world moral compass. For some, the premise feels too far-fetched, or the writing feels too heavy-handed to be believable, and that's a fair critique. But for those who can bridge that gap, Detroit becomes design as philosophy. It creates a controlled environment where you discover your own moral boundaries. You make the choices. The game doesn't tell you this is the right way to think. It just gives you a list of consequences that you have to deal with as a result of those choices. It's the difference between being told a lesson and being forced to learn it. Here's where it gets really uncomfortable, and this is where the designer's knowledge of the psyche really shines. A lot of times, there's no right or wrong choice. Did you have to pull the trigger because you wanted to save someone else? Or did you hesitate because you just couldn't find it in you to take a life, even an artificial one? For the player, the consequences of these choices can be equally severe. In those moments, the game actually makes you question yourself. You finish a scene, you see the outcome, and you're forced to wonder, if this was a real-world scenario with humans, which choice would I have made? When a game can hold up a mirror to your own survival instincts or your own prejudices, that's not just entertainment. That is a designer using the medium to perform a psychological audit on the player. If a game can make you feel genuine guilt, or make you sit in silence for a few minutes after the credits roll because you're reassessing your own moral compass, that's not just good writing. That's a designer who knows exactly how to navigate and manipulate the human brain. At which point, Kara, Connor, and Marcus stops being just characters. They've turned into mediums for players to discover who they actually are when the clock is ticking. So where does that leave you? Look, I've spent this whole video telling you that the barrier to entry to game design isn't as high as you think it is. But don't get it twisted. Not as high does not mean zero effort. This isn't a shortcut, and game design isn't a get-rich-quick scheme. Just like any worthwhile endeavor, you have to put in the work. Earlier, I said programming isn't a hard requirement, and I stand by that. But knowing how to code, even just the basics, helps you immensely. When a programmer tells you a mechanic is impossible, you'll actually understand the why. It turns you from a guy with a dream into a guy with a plan. It's like being an architect. You don't necessarily have to lay every brick yourself, but you damn well better understand how and why a foundation supports a skyscraper. In 2026, we're living in a golden age for non-coders. Nowadays, tools like Unity and Unreal Engine support visual coding, which is a godsend for people who think in logic but don't want to stare at syntax all day and prefer to drag and drop. Even Godot Engine, which recently moved away from native visual scripting, has community plugins that bring that functionality back. If you don't like any of these, you can find plenty of other tools on Steam or even GitHub. The barrier to speaking the language of the machine has never been lower. If you look at the legends, the names that built this industry, well, you can say that most of them started by getting their hands dirty in the source code. Jordan Mechner, Hideo Kojima, Akira Nishitani, John Romero. These guys weren't just idea guys. They lived in the engine. Even Sid Meier programmed the first Civilization game himself. But here's the thing. The goal isn't to be the best coder in the room. It's to be the person who understands the machine. Nowadays, Sid Meier leaves the actual coding to his team. He doesn't need to be in the IDE 24/7 because he provides the blueprint, the framework for the entire team to work within. The team understands exactly what kind of a product a Sid Meier game needs to be. And if you're thinking that perfect code is the only thing that matters, look at Toby Fox. The man built Undertale, a massive culture-shifting hit using what many programmers would call brute force code. If you look at the technical breakdowns, he famously used massive lists of if statements, where a textbook approach would have used a complex database. But guess what? The game worked perfectly for players. He didn't let perfect code get in the way of giving players a great experience. Players don't care about the syntax. Players don't see the variables. What players feel is the dynamics and the aesthetics. Players feel the heart of the design. The takeaway is this. The software is just a tool. The code is literally just a language. The real design happens in your head. It's the logic you build to make someone feel something, or to challenge them, or to just give them a damn good time. And that good time doesn't just happen by accident. It requires a bridge between your ideas and reality. This is where a lot of people trip up. They confuse the vision with the execution. Look, you need the big picture. You have to be able to see the whole ecosystem. The story's direction, the visual identity, the mechanics in play, or the acoustic vibe. If you don't have that North Star, that guiding light, so to speak, you're going to end up rowing in circles. The challenge is not letting that grand vision become a weight that keeps you from actually building. It's easy to design a universe in your head, to create a grand scheme of a century-long conflict ending in a battle of epic proportions. But it's incredibly hard to execute a polished 10-minute loop, or to write very specific details about a side character. The real skill is holding that massive world in your mind while having the discipline to make the small, specific details actually function. A map is useless if the engine won't start. You've been watching for over 20 minutes, so by now I'm sure you understand that the engine is where your logic meets the player's expectations. So if you're really into making games, do yourself a favor and stop making excuses about what you cannot do and start focusing on the logic of what you want to do. The industry, it needs people who actually understand the soul of the machine, not just people who can draw a pretty face or push a political agenda. Go build something, even if the code isn't perfect or maybe even outright garbage. Just make sure that the design has a soul. Put your heart into it. That's all for today. If this helped you put things into perspective or gave you that push to make a decision, let me know in the comments. Hit the like button, subscribe if you're new, or join the Discord if you want to talk more shit about design. I'm always looking for suggestions on what we should dive into next. Class dismissed. I'll see you in the next one.